So let's go back in time again, 2,000 years ago. And earlier we were talking about the Apostle Paul, who lived in the first century AD. If we just go a century before in Rome, first century BC, we're with some of the most famous Latin authors of all time. And these are people like Cicero and Julius Caesar and many others. So if we think of someone like Cicero, his name was Cicero. That's how they would have said it in classical Latin. All the C's are hard, so it's like a K. So Cicero, which just means chickpea, which is one of these great names. So Cicero or Cicero is walking around, and of course he was a Latin speaker. He was a native Latin speaker, just like Caesar and all of his contemporaries. And Caesar was an amazing author, just like Cicero was an amazing author. You would speak to them in Latin, and they would speak in Latin just like we're speaking English. And that would be the case for the next several centuries in Italy. And in fact, in many parts of the world, that was the case for several centuries. Now, what happened over time is Latin essentially evolved. And there were people like soldiers, for instance, who were Latin speakers, and maybe they eventually ended up retiring in Spain, for instance, which of course was part of the Roman Empire. And as they retire in Spain over the centuries, they find that their language begins evolving, and over time that turns into something like Spanish. Now, Spanish is a Romance language that comes from Latin, but there's several degrees of evolution that occur. And you think, well, when is the stopping point? For instance, when, let's say you're talking to Cicero in the first century BC and it's all in Latin, but when do you get to a point where that can no longer work in another time period? So when can you not go into Italy or Spain, for instance, and speak Latin and people can speak back to you in Latin? Well, that's still going to be several centuries down the line, and it's going to be as these Romance languages evolve, then that's when Latin becomes something that's not spoken as much. So we're really kind of looking at a time period in the 500s, 600s, 700s AD. And we see this when Charlemagne comes around in the 8th century, and he decides that we really need to standardize Latin. And the fact that they're standardizing Latin is telling us that people aren't speaking it anymore, at least in the same way that they had been before. Now, of course, they're still using it as they study. When you go to college, for instance, it's all in Latin. But when you go home at the end of the day, you're not speaking in Latin. You're speaking in medieval French or medieval German or something like that. So it's going to be several centuries after the time of Christ when Latin as a spoken medium is no longer used, we would say on the streets or at home, although it continues to be the language where you write things down, continues to be the language of study. So anytime you want to study something, you do so in Latin, not in French or in Spanish. And it's going to take centuries before you would actually go to school and you would study the material in Spanish.